The morning mist hung thick around Buckingham Palace as James Morrison adjusted his scarlet tunic one final time. 23 years he had stood guard at these gates, through rain and shine, protests and celebrations. His polished boots clicked against the cobblestones as he took his position. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat settling on his shoulders like an old friend. James had joined the Queen's Guard straight from military school, driven by a dream that burned bright in his young heart. He wanted to serve the crown, to be part of something greater than himself. His grandfather had told him stories of the old days when honor meant everything and duty came before personal comfort. Those stories had shaped James into the man he became. The palace buzzed with unusual activity that September morning. Staff members hurried past with worried expressions, their whispered conversations creating an atmosphere of tension that James could feel in his bones. Something was different today, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, James noticed the black flags being raised slowly up the palace flagpoles. His heart sank as the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. The Queen was gone. Elizabeth II, the woman he had sworn to protect and serve, had passed away during the night. Tears stung his eyes, but James remained perfectly still. The training had taught him to maintain composure no matter what emotions churned inside. Yet this felt different from any other challenge he had faced. The Queen wasn't just his sovereign. She had been the constant in his life, the North Star that guided his every action. During his years of service, James had caught glimpses of the Queen during her daily walks in the palace gardens. She always nodded politely when she saw the guards, and once during a particularly cold winter day, she'd even asked if the guards needed warmer gloves. That small gesture of kindness had meant the world to James. The palace gates opened and official cars began arriving. Important people in dark suits stepped out, their faces grave and serious. James recognized some of them from newspaper photographs, government ministers, royal family members, and other dignitaries. Each arrival brought the reality of the situation closer to home. As the day wore on, James learned through the whispered conversations of passing staff members that plans were already being made for the transition of power. King Charles would be crowned, and his wife Camilla would become queen consort. The thought made James's stomach twist with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him about Princess Diana. How beautiful she was, how she cared for the common people, how she brought a warmth to the royal family that had been missing for generations. James's grandmother had cried the day Diana died, and she never quite forgave those she blamed for the princess's unhappiness. The afternoon brought news that shook James to his core. Tomorrow there would be a ceremony where King Charles and Queen Camilla would make their first official appearance. All guards would be expected to show proper respect and acknowledgement. The very thought of calling Camilla Your Majesty made James feel sick. As evening approached and James's shift neared its end, he found himself thinking about his oath of service. He had promised to serve the crown faithfully, but what happened when the crown represented something he could no longer believe in? The weight of his uniform felt heavier than usual, and the proud red fabric seemed to mock his inner turmoil. Walking home through the London streets, James passed groups of people laying flowers and leaving messages for the deceased queen. Their genuine grief reminded him that he wasn't alone in his feelings. The Queen had meant something special to millions of people, and her passing marked the end of an era. That night, James sat in his small apartment, staring at his uniform hanging in the wardrobe. The medals and insignia that had once filled him with pride now seemed like reminders of a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He thought about his grandfather's stories of honor and duty, and wondered what the old man would do in this situation. The television news showed footage of Camilla arriving at the palace, already being referred to by some as the new queen. James turned off the TV and sat in silence, knowing that tomorrow would bring a choice that could change his life forever. The boy who had dreamed of serving the crown was about to face his greatest test. The alarm clock rang at 5 a.m, but James had been awake for hours. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts that kept circling back to the same impossible question. How could he bow his head to someone he believed had caused so much pain to the woman he truly respected? James's morning routine felt mechanical and hollow. He shaved with the same precision he had practiced for over 2 decades, but his hands trembled slightly as he held the razor. The face looking back at him in the mirror seemed older somehow, marked by a night of sleepless worry and moral conflict. The walk to Buckingham Palace took him through Hyde Park, where early morning joggers and dog walkers went about their normal routines. Life continued as usual for most people, but for James, everything had changed. The familiar landmarks looked different, as if he was seeing them through new eyes. At the palace, the atmosphere was electric with preparation. James could see workers setting up barriers and arranging flowers that had been pouring in from around the world. Television crews tested their equipment, and security personnel checked every corner with extra care. Today would be watched by millions of people around the globe. James's fellow guards greeted him with the usual morning nods, but he could see the same uncertainty in their eyes that he felt in his heart. They were all facing the same challenge, though most seemed willing to simply follow orders and adapt to the new reality. James envied their ability to separate personal feelings from professional duty. Captain Williams, the officer in charge of the guard, called the men together for a special briefing. His voice was crisp and professional as he explained the day's protocol. When King Charles and Queen Camilla appeared, all guards were to maintain perfect posture and show appropriate respect. Any deviation from standard procedure would result in immediate disciplinary action. The words hit James like physical blows. Queen Camilla, even hearing it spoken aloud, made his chest tight with anger and sadness. He thought about Princess Diana's sons, William and Harry, and wondered how they felt about their stepmother now holding the title that should have belonged to their mother. As the morning progressed, crowds began gathering outside the palace gates. James watched them through his peripheral vision, noting the mix of excitement and mourning on their faces. Some carried pictures of the late Queen Elizabeth, while others held signs welcoming the new king. The division in public opinion was clear, and James realized he wasn't the only one struggling with conflicted emotions. Around midday, word spread that the royal couple would emerge in less than an hour. James felt his palms grow sweaty inside his white gloves. His heart pounded so hard he was sure the tourists taking pictures could hear it. Every fiber of his being screamed against what he was being asked to do. James closed his eyes and tried to remember his training. Discipline, honor, duty. These were the pillars that had supported his entire adult life. But another voice in his head, one that sounded remarkably like his grandmother, whispered about loyalty to the memory of Diana and respect for the queen who had just passed away. The internal battle grew stronger as the minutes ticked by. James thought about his career, his pension, his reputation. Breaking protocol would mean the end of everything he had worked for. He would be dismissed in disgrace, his name forever associated with insubordination and disrespect. The practical side of his mind urged him to simply do his job and keep his personal feelings private. But then he remembered the night Princess Diana died. He had been a young guard then, new to his position and eager to please. He had watched the flowers pile up outside the palace, had seen the genuine grief of ordinary people who felt they had lost someone special. The royal family's cold response to that outpouring of love had troubled him even then. The sound of approaching footsteps made James's decision for him. His body tensed as he heard the palace doors opening. The moment he had been dreading was about to arrive, and despite all his internal debate, he still didn't know what he would do when faced with the choice between his conscience and his career. Fellow guards around him straightened their posture and prepared for the formal presentation. James could feel their readiness, their willingness to embrace the new era. But his own body felt frozen, caught between two opposing forces that threatened to tear him apart. The crowd outside grew quiet with anticipation. Cameras clicked and whirred. History was about to be made, and James Morrison, palace guard of 23 years, stood at the center of a personal storm that would soon break over everyone present. The palace doors swung open with a sound that seemed to echo through James's entire being. King Charles emerged first, his face serious and dignified as he took his first steps as the new monarch. The crowd outside erupted in a mixture of cheers and respectful applause, their voices carrying across the courtyard like a wave of sound. James's fellow guards snapped to attention with military precision. Their movements synchronized after years of practice. The red tunics formed a perfect line of respect and ceremony, each man embodying the tradition and honor of the Queen's Guard. But James felt like he was watching the scene from outside his own body, disconnected from the moment that should have been the pinnacle of his service. Then Camilla appeared at Charles's side, wearing an elegant black dress with a small hat perched gracefully on her head. The crowd's reaction was more mixed now. Some cheered enthusiastically while others remained respectfully quiet. James could see the cameras focusing on her face, capturing every expression for the history books. The royal couple began their slow walk toward the guards, following the traditional path that would bring them directly in front of James's position. With each step they took, James felt his heart beating faster. His mouth went dry and sweat began to form under his heavy bearskin hat, despite the cool September air. Captain William stood at attention nearby, his eyes scanning the line of guards to ensure everything was perfect. James could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a physical force. Everyone assumed he would simply do his duty, just as he had done thousands of times before. But as King Charles and Camilla drew closer, images flashed through James's mind like photographs from a family album. Princess Diana laughing with her sons, her face glowing with genuine happiness. The Queen Mother's disapproving expression whenever Camilla's name was mentioned in the early days. The late Queen Elizabeth's careful neutrality whenever asked about her son's relationship choices. James thought about his grandmother's final words to him before she passed away 3 years earlier. She had gripped his hand tightly and made him promise to always stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. At the time, he had assumed she was talking about general principles of honesty and integrity. Now he wondered if she had somehow foreseen this exact moment. The royal couple was now just 10 feet away. James could see the details of their faces, the way Charles carried himself with new authority, the careful composure that Camilla maintained despite what must have been enormous pressure. In any other circumstances, James might have felt sympathy for them both, recognizing the burden they had inherited along with their new titles. But sympathy wasn't what filled James's heart as they approached. Instead, he felt a deep, aching loyalty to memories that seemed more real to him than the present moment. The memory of Diana's kindness to ordinary people. The memory of Queen Elizabeth's steady, reassuring presence throughout his entire adult life. The memory of his grandmother's unwavering moral compass, 5 feet away now. James could hear the soft sound of Camilla's shoes on the palace stones. He could see the expectation in Captain William's eyes, the readiness of his fellow guards to acknowledge their new queen. The moment of truth was racing toward him like an oncoming train, and he still hadn't made his decision. 3 feet, 2 feet. The royal couple was directly in front of him now, and James felt time slow down to an almost unbearable crawl. Every instinct told him to bow his head, to follow protocol, to protect his career and reputation. The practical voice in his mind screamed warnings about the consequences of defiance. But another voice, quieter but somehow stronger, whispered about promises made to himself and to people who were no longer alive to see them kept. It spoke about the difference between serving the crown as an institution and serving the values that had made that institution meaningful in the first place. King Charles was looking directly at him now, waiting for the traditional acknowledgement. Camilla stood beside her husband, her eyes focused ahead but certainly aware of the protocol that was about to unfold. The entire scene felt frozen in time, waiting for James to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but his entire understanding of who he was as a man. Captain Williams had noticed the slight delay and was beginning to frown. The other guards remained perfectly still, but James could sense their growing awareness that something was wrong. The crowd outside continued their respectful noise, unaware of the drama playing out in the small space between a palace guard and his new monarchs. James Morrison, 23-year veteran of the Queen's Guard, stood at the crossroads of his life and made his choice. James kept his head perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the royal couple. While every other guard bowed in respectful acknowledgement of their new queen, James remained absolutely motionless, his posture rigid with a defiance that seemed to radiate from his very soul. The silence that followed was deafening. King Charles's expression shifted from expectation to confusion, then to something approaching anger. Camilla's face remained carefully neutral, but James could see a flicker of hurt in her eyes that almost made him regret his decision. Almost, but not quite. Captain Williams stepped forward quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "Guard Morrison," he barked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a whip. "Show proper respect to their majesties immediately." But James remained still as a statue, his jaw set with determination that surprised even himself. 23 years of military discipline warred with 23 years of accumulated emotion, and emotion was winning. He could feel the eyes of everyone present burning into him, but he couldn't bring himself to bow to someone he believed had hurt the woman he had truly served with pride. The crowd outside had begun to notice the commotion. Cameras swung toward the unusual scene, capturing the moment when protocol crumbled under the weight of personal conviction. James could hear murmurs spreading through the gathered people, their excitement mixing with confusion as they tried to understand what was happening. King Charles took a step closer to James, his voice low but clearly audible to those nearby. "Guard, you will show proper respect to your queen immediately, or face the consequences of your insubordination." The royal tone carried all the authority of generations of monarchs, but James felt strangely unmoved by it. Instead, James found his voice for the first time. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," he said, his words clear and steady despite the trembling in his hands. "There was only one queen in my service, and she passed away yesterday. I cannot in good conscience acknowledge any other." The words hung in the air like an explosive that had just been detonated. Captain Williams looked as though he might faint from shock, while the other guards remained frozen in their positions, unsure whether to maintain their own protocol or react to their colleagues' unprecedented rebellion. Camilla's carefully maintained composure finally cracked slightly. "I understand your loyalty to Queen Elizabeth," she said quietly, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed genuine. "She was a remarkable woman who deserves every bit of respect you're showing her memory. But the monarchy must continue, and with it the traditions that have kept this institution strong." James felt his resolve waver for just a moment. In her voice he heard not the calculating woman his grandmother had described, but a person who was trying to navigate an impossible situation with dignity. For a split second he almost reconsidered his stance, but then he thought about Princess Diana's funeral, about the young princes walking behind their mother's coffin, about the way the royal family had seemed so cold and distant during the nation's outpouring of grief. He thought about all the times he had wondered what might have been different if Diana had lived to become queen. "I'm sorry, ma'am," James said, using the term he might use for any lady but carefully avoiding the royal title. "But I cannot compromise my principles even for the crown. My loyalty was to Queen Elizabeth, and it died with her." The crowd outside had grown completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Television cameras zoomed in on James's face, capturing every detail of his expression for broadcast around the world. Social media would soon explode with videos and commentary about the guard who refused to acknowledge the new queen. Captain Williams was practically vibrating with fury. "Morrison, you are hereby relieved of duty and will report for disciplinary action immediately. Your behavior is a disgrace to the uniform and everything it represents." James began to remove his bearskin hat, his movements slow and deliberate. As he lifted it from his head, his gray hair caught the morning sunlight, and for the first time in hours he felt like he could breathe freely. The hat had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, but setting it down felt like lifting a weight from his soul. 23 years I've worn this uniform with pride," James said, his voice growing stronger with each word. 23 years I've stood guard over a monarchy I believed represented something noble and decent. But I won't dishonor the memory of the only queen I ever truly served by pretending otherwise now." King Charles and Camilla exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to handle a situation that had spiraled far beyond anything they could have anticipated. The planned ceremony was in ruins, the carefully orchestrated show of continuity and stability, shattered by one man's refusal to bend his conscience to political necessity. As James began to walk away from his post, leaving his hat and the life he had known behind, he heard someone in the crowd begin to clap. Slowly, others joined in, until a significant portion of the gathered people were applauding his stand. The sound followed him as he walked toward an uncertain future, carrying nothing but his principles and the knowledge that he had finally kept the promise he made to his grandmother. The small room where James waited for his disciplinary hearing felt like a prison cell. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and a single wooden chair created an atmosphere of institutional coldness that matched the chill in his heart. He had been sitting there for 3 hours, watching the clock tick away the final moments of his military career. Through the thin walls, James could hear the sounds of the palace continuing its daily operations. Guards marching in formation, officers giving orders, the general buzz of an organization that had barely missed a beat despite the morning's unprecedented disruption. It was as if his 23 years of service and his dramatic stand had been absorbed and processed, like any other minor administrative hiccup. The door opened, and Captain Williams entered with two other senior officers James recognized, but had rarely spoken to. Their expressions were stern and professional, showing no hint of the personal relationships that had developed over decades of shared service. James understood that this was no longer about friendship or loyalty between soldiers. This was about preserving the institution. "Guard Morrison," Captain Williams began, reading from a formal document, "you are hereby charged with insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and conduct unbecoming of a member of Her Majesty's Guard. How do you respond to these charges?" James had prepared for this moment during his long wait. "I accept full responsibility for my actions, sir. I will not offer excuses or attempt to justify what I did. I made a choice based on my personal convictions, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." The senior officers exchanged glances. Colonel Hartwell, a man James had respected for years, leaned forward. "Morrison, you've served with distinction for over 2 decades. Your record is exemplary in every way except for this morning's incident. If you're willing to issue a public apology and acknowledge your error, we might be able to arrange a quiet retirement with your pension intact." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. James's practical side screamed at him to accept it. He was 51 years old with no other marketable skills. His pension represented security for the rest of his life, and without it, his future looked bleak and uncertain. But accepting the offer would mean admitting he was wrong, that his stand had been a mistake born of emotion, rather than principle. It would mean betraying everything he had felt standing in front of Camilla, all the conviction that had driven him to risk everything for a moment of truth. "I appreciate the offer, sir," James said quietly, "but I can't apologize for something I believe was right. I won't pretend that my actions were wrong just to make things easier for everyone." Colonel Hartwell's expression softened slightly. "James, think about what you're saying. You're throwing away your entire future for what? A gesture that won't change anything? The monarchy will continue, Camilla will be queen, and your sacrifice will be forgotten within a week." James looked down at his hands, noting how strange they looked without the white gloves he had worn for so many years. "Maybe you're right, sir. Maybe it won't change anything in the grand scheme of things, but it changed something in me. For the first time in months, I feel like I acted according to my true beliefs instead of just following orders." The third officer, Major Stevens, spoke for the first time. "Morrison, you do understand that this means immediate dismissal without pension, don't you? You'll leave here with nothing except your civilian clothes. No references, no benefits, no acknowledgement of your years of service. Is your conscience really worth that much?" The question hit James like a physical blow. He thought about his small apartment, his modest savings, the uncertain job market for a man his age with only military experience. He thought about the comfortable retirement he had planned, the quiet dignity he had expected to enjoy after a lifetime of faithful service. But then he thought about his grandmother's funeral, about the promise he had made to her memory. He thought about Princess Diana's sons and wondered if they would understand what he had tried to do. He thought about the late Queen Elizabeth and whether she would have respected his choice, even if she couldn't have approved of it. "Yes, sir," James said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was giving up. "It's worth it. Some things matter more than security or comfort. I'd rather face an uncertain future with my integrity intact than spend my retirement knowing I compromised my deepest beliefs for money." Captain Williams sighed heavily, looking older than James had ever seen him. "Very well, Morrison. You leave us no choice." He stamped the dismissal papers with more force than necessary. "You are hereby dismissed from Her Majesty's Guard, effective immediately. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave the premises." As James stood to leave, Colonel Hartwell called out one final time, "For what it's worth, Morrison, I understand why you did what you did. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. There aren't many men left who would sacrifice everything for their principles." James nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know." Walking out of the palace for the last time, James felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. Behind him lay the structured life he had known for over 2 decades. Ahead lay uncertainty, financial hardship, and the challenge of rebuilding his life from scratch at an age when most men were looking forward to retirement. But as he passed through the palace gates as a civilian for the first time in 23 years, James Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace with himself and the choices he had made. The video appeared on social media within hours of James's dismissal. Someone in the crowd had captured the entire confrontation on their phone, and by evening it had been viewed millions of times across the globe. The footage showed James standing firm while his fellow guards bowed, his face a mask of quiet determination as he refused to acknowledge Camilla as queen. James discovered his newfound internet fame when his landlord knocked on his door that evening, holding a tablet showing the viral video. "That's you, isn't it?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her eyes wide with amazement. "The whole world is talking about what you did." Sitting in his small living room, James watched himself on the screen with a mixture of fascination and horror. The comment section was a battlefield of opposing opinions. Some called him a hero standing up for Princess Diana's memory, while others labeled him a traitor who had disgraced the monarchy. The intensity of the reactions surprised him. He had acted purely on personal conviction, never imagining his choice would resonate so widely. His phone began ringing constantly. Reporters from newspapers and television stations around the world wanted interviews. Book publishers called with offers for his memoirs. Documentary filmmakers proposed telling his story. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had spent his career deliberately remaining invisible and professional. James declined most of the interview requests, but he did agree to speak with one local reporter who had covered royal events respectfully for years. During their conversation, James tried to explain that his actions weren't meant as an attack on the monarchy itself, but rather as a personal statement about loyalty and conscience. "I'm not anti-royalist," James explained patiently. "I served the crown faithfully for over 2 decades. But my loyalty was to Queen Elizabeth personally, not just to the institution. When she died, that specific relationship died with her. I couldn't pretend to feel the same way about her successor." The interview was published the next day, and it sparked even more debate. Constitutional experts debated whether James's actions constituted a legitimate form of civil disobedience or simply insubordination. Psychologists analyzed his motivations, and royal commentators discussed the implications for the monarchy's stability. Meanwhile, James faced the practical realities of unemployment. His military pension was gone, and his savings wouldn't last long in expensive London. He began looking for work, but most employers seemed either intimidated by his notoriety or concerned about hiring someone who had publicly defied authority. After 2 weeks of unsuccessful job hunting, James received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as Thomas Whitfield, owner of a small security company that specialized in protecting historical sites and private estates. "Mr. Morrison," Whitfield said, "I've been following your story in the news. I run a company that values integrity above all else, and I believe what you did took tremendous courage. I'd like to offer you a position if you're interested." The job wasn't glamorous. James would be guarding a Tudor mansion that had been converted into a museum, but it offered steady income and a chance to rebuild his life. More importantly, his new employer respected his principles rather than seeing them as a liability. On his first day at Whitfield Manor, James felt strange wearing a simple security uniform instead of his elaborate palace regalia. But as he walked through the historic rooms filled with artifacts from England's past, he realized that he was still protecting something important. The manor represented the same traditions and heritage he had served at Buckingham Palace, just on a smaller, more personal scale. The museum visitors often recognized James from the viral video. Some approached him with praise for his stand, while others expressed disapproval. James learned to respond to both reactions with the same polite professionalism he had developed during his palace years. One afternoon, an elderly woman approached him during his rounds. She walked with a cane and wore an expensive coat that suggested wealth and status. When she spoke, her accent marked her as aristocracy. "You're the guard who wouldn't bow to Camilla, aren't you?" she asked directly. James tensed, preparing for another lecture about duty and tradition. "Yes, ma'am, I am." To his surprise, the woman smiled warmly. "Good for you, young man. I knew Diana personally. She was a dear friend of my daughter's. That woman deserved to be queen, and anyone who remembers her with such loyalty has my respect." The conversation reminded James that his actions had meant something to people who shared his feelings about Diana and the royal family. While he had lost his career and financial security, he had gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that he had acted with courage when faced with a choice between comfort and conviction. As weeks turned into months, James settled into his new life. The viral fame gradually faded, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of honest work and peaceful conscience. He had lost everything he thought mattered, but in the process, he had discovered what truly did matter to him. Late at night, when the museum was closed and he walked alone through the silent halls, James sometimes thought about his grandmother and what she would say about his choice. He imagined her voice, proud and strong, telling him that some things were worth any sacrifice. 2 years after his dismissal from the palace, James Morrison received a letter that would change his perspective on everything that had happened. The envelope was expensive paper, hand-addressed in elegant script with no return address to hint at its contents. James opened it carefully, curiosity overcoming the caution he had developed about unexpected correspondence. The letter was from Prince William himself. Written in his own hand, it was brief but deeply personal. William thanked James for his loyalty to his mother's memory and acknowledged the sacrifice he had made. The prince wrote that while he understood the complexities of the current situation, he would never forget those who honored Diana's legacy, even at great personal cost. James read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling with emotion. He had never expected acknowledgement from Diana's son, never imagined that his stand would reach the people who mattered most. The letter didn't solve his financial problems or restore his career, but it validated his choice in a way that meant more than any amount of money. The museum where James worked had become an unexpected sanctuary. Visitors often shared their own stories of moral courage, inspired by his example to reflect on times when they had faced similar choices between security and principle. James found himself becoming an unofficial counselor to people struggling with their own ethical dilemmas. One spring morning, as James was unlocking the museum doors for the day, he noticed a familiar figure walking up the gravel path. Captain Williams, now retired himself, approached with tentative steps and an expression that mixed regret with curiosity. "Hello, James," Williams said quietly. "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I wanted to see how you were doing." James welcomed his former commanding officer inside, and they walked through the Tudor rooms while Williams admired the historical displays. Eventually, they settled in the museum's small cafe, where James had become friendly with the staff who treated him like family. "I owe you an apology," Williams said after they had ordered tea. "At the time, I thought you were destroying everything we stood for. But I've had 2 years to think about it, and I've come to understand that you were actually defending something we had forgotten. The idea that service means more than just following orders." The conversation stretched for hours, as both men reflected on their years of service and the changes that had swept through the institution they had devoted their lives to. Williams admitted that many of the guards had privately struggled with the same feelings James had experienced, but none had possessed the courage to act on them. "The funny thing is," Williams said as their visit neared its end, "the palace is different now. There's more discussion about the emotional well-being of the staff, more recognition that we're human beings with our own loyalties and beliefs. Your stand, as much as it disrupted things at the time, forced some important conversations." As summer arrived, James received another unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 20s appeared at the museum, asking specifically to speak with him. She introduced herself as Sarah Morrison, no relation, despite the shared surname, and explained that she was a university student writing her thesis on modern civil disobedience. "Your story has become a case study in my program," Sarah explained enthusiastically. "Not just for what you did, but for how you handled the consequences. You lost everything but never expressed regret or bitterness. That kind of integrity is rare." Through Sarah, James learned that his story was being taught in ethics classes and leadership programs. Business schools used his example to discuss the tension between personal values and organizational loyalty. His refusal to bow had become a symbol of authentic courage in an age when such displays were increasingly rare. The irony wasn't lost on James that his moment of greatest professional failure had become his most significant contribution to the world. By losing his career, he had found his purpose. By standing alone, he had inspired others to examine their own principles. On the second anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death, James visited her grave privately, laying a simple bouquet of flowers he had picked from the museum's garden. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, he spoke to her memory as if she were listening. "I hope I did right by you, Your Majesty," he said softly. "I hope you understand that my loyalty was never about politics or personal grudges. It was about honoring what you represented, duty, service, and putting principles before convenience." The wind rustled through the trees, and James felt a sense of peace that had eluded him during his years of internal conflict. He had chosen a difficult path, but it was his path, chosen freely and followed with conviction. Walking back to his small apartment that evening, James reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had less money, lower status, and fewer comforts than before, but he possessed something infinitely more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that when tested, he had chosen correctly. The boy who had dreamed of serving the crown had become a man who understood that true service sometimes meant having the courage to say no. In losing everything he thought he wanted, James Morrison had found everything he actually needed: respect for himself and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to his deepest beliefs. His story would be remembered long after the news cycles moved on, a testament to the power of individual conscience in a world that often demanded conformity above all else.